Welcome to another installment of the Conversations Across Generations. Today we have Dr. Charles Booth with us as we sit at his feet, and he gives us great pearls of wisdom as we forge a way forward doing ministry for our generation. I'm joined with Jeremy Battle from Birmingham, Alabama, a Midler at Harvard University's Divinity School. And, of course, I'm Willie Dwayne Francois III, Director of the African American Lectionary's Young Ministers Corner, and we look forward to a very productive and fruitful conversation about ministry and the state of our church. Dr. Booth, thank you for joining us today.
My joy and privilege.
I guess I'll start by asking, everyone admires you for your preaching, and many of us model your preaching. Would you mind giving us a peek into your preparation methods?
First of all, I'm very flattered by that. I have long been a proponent of what Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor taught us in our doctoral program of the Hegelian dialectic. And for me, I think that preaching always begins with a proposition. And the proposition is a succinct, declarative sentence that shares with you, first of all, exactly what it is that the sermon says. And if you cannot put it in one sentence, then you're not clear exactly on what it is you're trying to preach. The proposition is primarily for me, the preacher, but at the same time, I'm thinking that at the end of the preaching experience, the person or persons who walk away from that experience ought to be able to say, when asked, what did the preacher preach? Tell that person or those persons in one sentence exactly what it is that you are trying to say. Now, once you get that clear in your mind, you look at the text, and every text has a tension. And in that tension, you deal with a thesis. What is the text positively saying? What is it that God wants to get across? If there is a thesis, there must be an antithesis. If God is seeking to get something across in the text, what is mitigating against God? What in the text creates the tension? The tension created by the thesis and the antithesis produces what we call a relevant question. Every sermon has one relevant question. If you have more than one question, you have more than one sermon. Therefore, the synthesis, or the body of the sermon, is the reconciliation or the resolution that you bring about as a result of trying to deal with that tension between the thesis and the antithesis. And then, of course, once you build the body of the sermon and you look at what the text says by way of seeking to answer the relevant question, you then proceed to build the synthesis, and then you go into your celebration. And for me, regardless of what someone's preaching style may be, I think that every sermon to some extent is dialectical, in the sense that there is some tension trying to be resolved. And for me, that is paramount if I'm going to be very serious about what it is that the text is saying and what it is I'm trying to get across.
I think one of the other things, when you say dialectic, and we always think about sort of the context within which we preach.
Yeah.
How do you feel over the years your preaching was guided by your pastoral imagination? I wonder if you could kind of speak to us about sort of the pastoral dialectic that's involved.
I think that's an excellent question. I think for me, as I look back across my years, particularly at Mount Olivet, I'm in my 34th year now as pastor, that you look at the experiences of your people, and whatever you're dealing with pastorally, or I should say whatever you're dealing with textually, in some way comes out in your pastoral declarations. Preaching for me always deals with seeking to deal with where people live. Let me put it another way. Preaching for me must always be incarnational. Wow. The word must become flesh. It must be real. It must not be so esoteric, so upstairs, that it does not deal with where people live. And where people live is critical. And the Word of God must deal with where people are, where they are situationally, where they are in terms of circumstance. If we fail to do that, then I think we fail to make the word flesh. And that becomes our critical challenge, always being able to preach where people are, preach where people hurt. And that's one reason why I have been so adamantly opposed to prosperity preaching, which would seek to give people the false impression that everybody's got to have money, that everybody's going to be materially and tangibly prosperous, when in fact that's not the case at all. And sometimes we give people false hope or false expectation, so that preaching for me must have incarnate value. And if somebody walks away without saying the sermon has spoken to me, then I think the preacher has failed his or her job.
Thinking about an incarnational homiletic, for you, what has, in your homiletic imagination, where does the pastoral and the prophetic intersect?
I think that the pastoral and the prophetic intersect at the point of human need. Human need always defines that intersection. That where the person is in his or her life, in his or her experience, where there is some disturbance in the human experience involving that person, the prophetic word of God must enter in at that point of intersection, so that the person knows that here is a word from the Lord that is valuable, and here is a word that is timely. And we must always, as preachers, be in a position without fear to address that prophetic, that prophetic word, and to give it the nudge when it's needed. I'm not suggesting at all that you just stand up and get on a soapbox and go off on a tirade, but you deal with what that need is at that moment. Let's say, for example, when we look at the upcoming election in the fall of this year, it is undeniable, in my way of thinking, that the whole reality of racism is not prevalent and very much before us. I think that we have a choice now between what is right, basically, and what is wrong. I don't see Mitt Romney, the presumptive Republican candidate, being someone who is privy or sensitive to the needs of minorities, particularly African American people. That here is a man who comes from the corporate world, the business world, and yet our people live in a climate sociologically and from a psychological point as well, a place where there is need for some shaft of light to shine into the midst of this darkness. So that for me, the pastor must be sensitive to the issues of the time and how the issues of the time impact those persons who are a part of his or her pastoral charge.
All right, I think another question that, of course, arises when one hears you preach, immediately one cannot help but notice that there is such great theological depth and thought that goes in your sermon preparation. And for the preacher who's never had an education, for the preacher who's trying to think about theological education or trying to think about how they can develop their homiletical lens, how would you, are there certain books, or is there a particular time in your sort of journey as a preacher that this shift happened? And could you sort of briefly talk to us about?
Let me say this. Whether we are privy to a theological education or not, we are still held accountable to be students. And because one may not formally study in a theological education or institution, does not mean that someone is not a student. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was one of the greatest preachers ever in the English-speaking world, and yet Charles Haddon Spurgeon did not have a theological education. I don't know that there is a preacher more voluminous in terms of having written than Charles Haddon Spurgeon, but he was a person who read to a great extent, had his pulse on the times, and because he had his pulse on the times and was a very careful student of Scripture, he was able to really develop a homiletic that touched those in his generation. And it's no wonder that thousands of people would flock to hear him preach. No preacher has an excuse for not reading.
Wow.
And not only that, there are conferences such as the Hampton Ministers Conference available every year that would allow someone the experience of coming to a campus like this, hearing sermons, hearing lectures, that can feed into that person's ministry. A whole lot of people, for example, don't know the history of the Hampton Ministers Conference. In 2 years, this conference is going to be 100 years of age. The Hampton Ministers Conference was initially started as an opportunity for rural tidewater preachers in this particular area, Norfolk, Newport News, Suffolk, Portsmouth, to come to the campus once a year to get that kind of lecture and preaching that would deepen one's theological roots. Hampton, in its early days, was really not so much about preaching a sermon as it was hearing a lecture, because there was a need to open the eyes of rural preachers who did not have the benefit of a theological education. And I think that the world in which we live today, where information is so readily available, no one who is serious about preaching, no one who is serious about sharpening his or her homiletical edge, theological thought, you have no excuse now for not knowing where to go and what materials to pick up. There are so many venues available.
What texts, along with the Bible, have informed your theological orientation?
I like to read the lives of great preachers. For me, many years ago, I got 20 centuries of great preaching. And it's rather racist in the sense that in 20 centuries there were only 2 African Americans, John Jasper and Martin Luther King Jr. But I love to read biographies. I love to look at the commentaries of a William Barclay. His daily Bible reading series is excellent. He wrote a book that is still a treasure to me, The Mind of Jesus. And I think that anybody who reads The Mind of Jesus by William Barclay emerges with a strong sense of the life of Christ and the ministry of Christ, as both life and ministry are portrayed in the Gospels. He also wrote a wonderful book called The Mind of Paul, in which he deals with the Pauline epistles, but also the life of Paul. And if you can read those 2 books, you almost have a strong handle on the New Testament. And those books have always been at my fingertips. Somebody as basic as Warren Wiersbe is somebody worthy of reading. If for no other reason, then you have a basic approach to particularly New Testament understanding. And he also deals with some Old Testament books, but those are immediate texts that are at my fingertips. Let me just say another word. When I went to seminary in 1969, I went to Crozer. Ended up graduating from Easton, which is now Palmer. Crozer Theological Seminary in 1969 was, unbeknown to me, getting ready to close its doors in Chester and go up to Colgate, Rochester, where the merger took place. I sat at the feet of a man, and I don't know if you've ever heard the name of J. Pius Barber.
Yes, sir.
J. Pius Barber was a mentor to every African American student in the 50s and 60s who went through Crozer. He mentored Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., William Augustus Jones Jr., Harold A. Carter, just to name a few, and he mentored me. Dr. Barber said something to me in the fall of 1969 that I've never forgotten. He said to me that if you get a basic understanding of Old and New Testament, you ought to be able to go to a text and with your own imagination and with your own homiletical lens, deal with the text. He encouraged me never to go to a commentary first. Don't go to the Interpreter's Bible. Don't go to any of the commentaries first, because the commentaries can become a crutch to you, and you allow your own imagination, your own homiletical thinking to evaporate. And he used that word, evaporate. So he would always say, bring your own creative energy to the text. Go to the commentary when you have finished to make sure that you are precise in terms of dates and places and that kind of thing. But he would say to me, and I can hear him so clearly now, that if God could speak to a John Calvin or anybody else who writes the commentary, you're called, and if you have sufficient Old and New Testament understanding tucked beneath your belt, you ought to be able to approach a text and deal with it in an exegetical way that does not in any way impugn the text. I've never forgotten that. Never forgotten that.
A moment ago, you mentioned the political climate that we're in, and as we're approaching the election, we've been celebrating for the last 4 years the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama. And as you know, and everyone knows, his recent evolution on the issue of human sexuality has sort of engendered a lot of controversy and murmurings in our churches.
Yes, sir.
What do you think is the best approach for having honest and robust dialogue about the human condition, human sexuality, and spiritual life?
Let me say, first of all, that one must understand the position and posture from which the president speaks. He speaks from a constitutional position, a very political position, so that when he says that there is a right for two persons of the same sex to marry, he is speaking from the context and from the understanding that the Constitution grants that kind of liberty and freedom for all. He's entitled to that from a constitutional perspective. From a theological perspective, of course, I have ought, and I think the Christian community in general has ought. From a theological and biblical position, we cannot sanction that. And I'm not looking at Leviticus 18, I'm not looking at Romans 1, but I'm looking at Genesis 1, verse 27, where male and female created he them, that there is a division in terms of our sexuality. There is a male, there is a female. I think that there ought to be robust discussion about it in the church, that we ought not just go off and rail at the president because we disagree with him. I think that as our chief executive in this democratic republic, he is bound to obey what the Constitution says. But when we come to the church, we're not looking at the position from a political, constitutional, sociological position. We're looking at it from a theological and biblical position. And I think that there has to be some dialogue that allows people to disagree without being disagreed.
I think one question that comes up for any young preacher, young pastor who has taken on this call, looking at someone like you, one has to say, when is that moment when one gets comfortable in your skin and the call that God has given you, the particular prophetic voice that God has given you for this age? And I wonder what you could say to us about sort of that moment in your ministry where you feel, I guess in a certain way, where you sort of finally got sort of your voice and mature to start, I guess, developing your own sense of yourself and call.
That's an excellent question. I was very privileged in my early years to sit under Dr. Harold A. Carter, the senior pastor at New Shiloh Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. He came to Baltimore in 1965, and I was finishing my first year at Howard University as an undergraduate. Dr. Carter came from Lynchburg, Virginia, where he had been pastor of Court Street Baptist Church, where Vernon Johns was many years ago. He worked, Dr. Carter did, under Dr. King at Dexter Avenue. Dr. Carter was a student at Alabama State at the time. I sat under Dr. Harold Carter from my sophomore through my senior year at Howard University. And for those 3 years, I must confess, I was preaching with his voice. I heard in his voice the voice also of Dr. King. And unconsciously, those voices became a part of who I was becoming. When I went to seminary in 1969, I was called at the close of my first year, my junior year in seminary, to my first church in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It was at that moment when I began to pastor and preach every Sunday that I began the pilgrimage towards discovering my voice. I think that it is impossible for a preacher not to be heavily influenced and impacted by the one under whom he or she works. When you listen to somebody time after time, week after week, month after month, and when you become so respectful of who they are, without realizing it, you become immersed in their persona. And without realizing that immersion, you find yourself really imitating them without realizing it. But once you're situated in your own space and you have the repeated opportunity to preach Sunday after Sunday, you begin to capture your own voice. I know of some people, unfortunately, who became so immersed in the persona of such a strong preacher that they never found their own voice, which is a tragedy to me, because I think God calls us and uses us out of the beauty of our uniqueness. But it's only when you can distance yourself from that influence that you begin the pilgrimage towards the discovery of your own voice. And that's not to say also that there are not contributing factors. You know, when you listen to a Gardner C. Taylor, when you listen to a Sandy F. Ray, when you listen to a Samuel DeWitt Proctor, without realizing it, you begin to snatch snippets of their pulpit oratory and their ministry, if you will. And you, while appreciating that, come to the place also when you realize that while you may incorporate some of it, you incorporate it, but it comes out in the beauty of your discovered voice.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. This reminds me of Phillips Brooks' definition of preaching: truth through personality. And personalities are shaped by so many factors.
That's exactly right.
What do you think are some of the struggles, the victories, the joys of life and the pastorate that have shaped your voice, your preaching, your homiletic?
I can remember when I went to my first congregation in the winter of 1970. I was in my middle of year at that time, St. Paul's Baptist Church in Westchester. There was a tragedy that occurred in our community. A young 14-year-old girl was found strangled by a little creek not far from the church. And the tragedy was that she was strangled by a cousin, a member of the family. That shook me. And even now, as I recount that experience, I remain somewhat shaken. I remember going to the house that afternoon, and here I am, 24 years old, in my first church, pastoring less than a year. And I walk into this room with all of these people who are crying and who are grief-stricken. And they look to me for a word. And I had no word. And I discovered at that moment the ministry of silence. That sometimes there is a beauty and an articulation in silence that the verbal can never give. That was one defining moment for me. I have never forgotten that. Another strong defining moment for me, backing up somewhat now, in my undergraduate years, when Martin King died, and I was a junior at Howard University. I remember that night so clearly, and I remember going down to 14th and U Streets in Washington, and I remember seeing Stokely Carmichael holding a gun outside of the SNCC headquarters, saying, "Now tell me what love and nonviolence can do." And that was a moment for me, as I think back, that reacquainted me with my convictions. You have moments such as this in your personal struggle as well as in your pastoral life that do much to help shape what becomes not only your voice, but your particular perspective when it comes to preaching. The death of my mother back in 1991 was another defining moment for me. She was the dearest person to me. And for her suddenly to leave, and it wasn't that sudden, we were braced, she had cancer, but when she surrendered to death, and I had to do her eulogy, that for me was the most difficult and yet the easiest of tasks, if that makes any sense at all. But that for me was a defining moment. My point is, I think that the longer you live, preaching, pastor, there are defining moments. There's never a point at which the moments cease, because the moments help you to continue growing. And I have a problem with any preacher who says that he or she has arrived. There are always critical points in life and ministry that yet go into the making of who you are. When Phyllis Brooks talks about truth and personality, you can't talk about a human personality without talking about the tributaries or the streams that feed into that person. There is a family stream. There is a communal stream. There is an educational stream. And then there is the experiential stream. All of these things go into the making of the man or the making of the woman. And to use Gardner Taylor's expression, those experiences become our passport into the lives of other people.
Wow. That's beautiful. That's good. As I mentioned, Jeremy and I, we went to Harvard Divinity School together, and this question sort of grows out of some of the bias that we experienced there. What do you think is the relevance of black churches, amid the growing secularism and the new interest on multiculturalism, particularly against the backdrop of the dominant claims that the black church is irrelevant and behind on certain quote-unquote justice issues?
I think that the black church must never allow its or her history or her presence to be swallowed up in diversity. I have a problem with that. And I have a problem with that primarily because black people helped to build this country. America was built, as you very well know, on the backs of black people, slave labor. Asians can't make that claim. Latinos cannot make that claim. Hispanics can't make that claim. We can make that claim. I think that gives us a special place in the history of this country, in the history of this republic, as well as a special place in our understanding of the Christian gospel. We have been placed in a position where from slavery to the present, we have come now to look at a presence that has been meaningful to the nation and the world. I would never want to see the black church experience, black preaching, to be put somehow in some diverse bowl where it's just mixed up with everybody else. No, we have a uniqueness, if for no other reason than how we have survived all of these years. And not just survived, but survived with the love ethic of Jesus Christ. To have gone through what we have gone through, and yet at the end of the day, to still maintain this love ethic that we find in the gospel of Jesus Christ is, for me, magnanimous. You know Dr. Matt King Carter, who recently retired from the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Fort Lauderdale. Matt Carter studied under George Arthur Buttrick at Southern Baptist Seminary many years ago. And Dr. Carter said to me on one occasion that George Buttrick made the statement that the genius of black people is that given what we have gone through, and to come out of it still embracing the love ethic of Jesus Christ is nothing short of miraculous. And for me, that ought guarantee us a unique and special place in our understanding of the American experience. For those who criticize us for a lack of understanding when it comes to justice issues, I think that's grossly unfair. If anybody knows anything about injustice, it is us. And therefore our understanding, I feel, of injustice places us at a critical point where we see life through the lens of what is just as opposed to what is unjust.
I think one thing, as we begin to conclude, we appreciate your time. I think for a young generation that is so excited, so eager to preach, to pastor, to be a part of ministry, and as you have been doing this for a long time, I wonder if there were just one thing that you have noticed, or if you could just say to this young preaching, pastoring generation, what would you say to us? What would you urge us to think about? What would you urge us to keep as a major emphasis in our ministry work?
That is not a difficult question for me to answer at all. The one thing that I would say, the one salient word that I would leave is this: be faithful to the call and the task to which God has called. The dean at the Sammy DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union, his name is slipping me now, John Kinney. John Kinney rarely preaches or teaches without talking about faithfulness. And that's something that I've noticed about everything he says. At some point you're going to hear, if not openly, obliquely, some push towards being faithful. And for me, I would hope that your generation and every generation beyond that would be faithful to the call that has been entrusted to your care and your keeping. It is a sacred call. It is a holy call. And that means, for me, placing your ministry before self. I'm reading a little book now entitled Dying to Preach, which is a book in which a preacher does a marvelous exegetical study of 1 Corinthians. And in that he talks about how Paul was so serious about ministry that he subjugated and submerged self so that he would not in any way impugn the gospel that had been entrusted to him. And I'm reading that now. That's a wonderful book. I can't remember the author's name, but the book is entitled Dying to Preach. And I would encourage your generation to not get caught up in the material and the tangible, not to look at where certain successful pastors are, but find out what their story is. How did they get to where they are? What struggles were there? Perhaps I'm an anomaly, but when I was coming through seminary, I did not want to pastor. I felt that there was plenty of time to pastor, which is very different from today. So many preachers in your generation are so eager to get a church. I wanted the opportunity to study and to read without the burden of a church. And the reality of that pushed me to the point that even after I was called to my first church, I still wanted the luxury. And I took as many luxuries as I could to really stay focused in my seminary work, because I wanted to become, at the end of the day, a prepared preacher who would be faithful to his task.
Thank you, Dr. Booth, for such an instructive, organic conversation.
Thank you.
And we know that many young preachers and preachers of other generations will definitely benefit from your wisdom that you shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed meeting you.
Thanks so much.
God bless.
Yes, sir.